It stands among the most replayed 73 seconds in all of human history. A crisp, cold morning over Florida. A white orbiter rising into a sharp blue sky on a pillar of flame. Then, without any warning at all, a bloom of smoke where the spacecraft had just been. Two solid rocket boosters corkscrewing away from one another like the arms of some dreadful letter Y scratched across the heavens. On the ground below, parents held their hands above their eyes and waited for the crowd to erupt in celebration. It never did. A voice over the public address system struggled to make sense of something the human mind simply was not designed to process that fast. And in classrooms all across the country, children who had been promised a school teacher riding into space sat gathered around television screens, watching, not yet grasping what their teachers had already understood and what the grown-ups standing beside them could not bring themselves to say aloud. That image has been seared into the memory of an entire generation. January the 28th, 1986. The Space Shuttle Challenger. 7 names the world absorbed in a single afternoon and never truly released. Most people, even today, could describe the smoke trail hanging in the sky. Most people could tell you it blew apart. Most people believe that what unfolded that morning was immediate, complete, merciful, in how fast it came, that the crew never had a moment to know, that the fireball marked the end of the story. But the fireball was not the end of the story. What actually occurred in the minutes after those boosters spiraled apart, and in the days, the weeks, and the months that followed, is a chapter most people have simply never encountered. It is quieter than the explosion itself. It is more difficult to look at head-on. It involves a recovery effort that spread across hundreds of square miles of the Atlantic Ocean, a question that investigators were forced to face and could never answer with complete certainty, and a sequence of decisions made not to conceal the truth, but to shield 7 families from a depth of grief most of us will never have to imagine. This is the piece of the Challenger disaster that the cameras never captured. This is what came after. Before we go any further, this story needs to be told in a particular way. The facts surrounding what happened to the Challenger crew are real, and they are sobering, and they deserve to be handled with genuine care. NASA did not release every detail publicly in the days that followed the disaster, and over the years, that silence has been misread by some as secrecy, as a cover-up, as something with a darker motive. It was not. The discretion that surrounded both the recovery effort and the examination of the crew was, by every available account, an act of dignity, a deliberate and considered effort to protect the families and the memory of the dead from being turned into a spectacle. So we will move carefully here. We will not invent things. We will not reach for drama that does not belong. We will state what is known. We will be honest about what remains uncertain, and we will treat 7 human beings the way they deserve to be treated, as people, not as a headline. Because on that morning, 7 people climbed inside that vehicle with their whole lives still ahead of them. There was Dick Scobee, the commander, a former combat pilot, composed and widely respected, the kind of man who wore the burden of leadership without letting it show. Seated beside him in the pilot's chair was Michael Smith, a Navy aviator embarking on what was supposed to be his very first voyage into space. Behind and around them sat the mission specialists, Judith Resnik, an electrical engineer and only the 2nd American woman ever to fly in space, brilliant and precise in everything she did. Ellison Onizuka, an aerospace engineer raised in Hawaii, the first person of Asian American heritage to reach orbit. Ronald McNair, a physicist holding a doctorate from a prestigious institution, a man who had grown up under the segregated South and still stretched his hands toward the stars. And then there were the payload specialists. Gregory Jarvis, an engineer who had waited through delays and been bumped from earlier missions, finally getting the opportunity he had earned. And Christa McAuliffe, a high school social studies teacher from New Hampshire, selected from a pool of more than 11,000 applicants to become the first ordinary citizen, the first teacher, to fly aboard the shuttle. She had planned to teach lessons from up in orbit. Her own students were among those watching. That is exactly why so many children were tuned in at all. These were 7 people with spouses, with kids, with parents who had made the drive down to Florida just to watch them launch. And they should not have been flying that morning. The night before liftoff, temperatures in Florida had dropped far below anything typical for that time of year, falling to somewhere around 36 degrees Fahrenheit by the early hours. Ice built up on the launch tower. Icicles dangled from the metal scaffolding surrounding the pad in the darkness. The shuttle had never once been launched in cold like that, and there were engineers on that very night who were deeply worried about what those temperatures might cause. But the mission had already been pushed back 6 separate times. Weather, mechanical problems, scheduling conflicts, one delay after another. Pressure had been quietly accumulating, the kind that never announces itself, but works its way into every choice being made. There were broadcast schedules to consider, public expectations to meet, and a teacher whose space-based lessons had already been woven into classroom plans all across the country. The momentum of the moment wanted to move forward. And so, in spite of the ice, in spite of the cold, in spite of the warnings we will come back to later, the countdown kept going. At 11:38 in the morning, Challenger rose from the pad. For that first minute, everything appeared flawless. The shuttle rolled, arced out above the Atlantic, and climbed higher. The crowd roared. Mission Control called out the familiar checkpoints. And then, 73 seconds into the flight, at an altitude of roughly 48,000 feet, something failed. In the cockpit recordings that were later recovered, the final, clearly audible words came from the pilot, Michael Smith. He said simply, "Uh-oh." And a fraction of a second after that, the vehicle broke apart. Here is the first thing almost everyone gets wrong about that moment. What the world witnessed, that enormous billowing cloud of fire and smoke, was not the crew cabin blowing up. It was the external fuel tank, that massive rust-colored cylinder the shuttle was mounted against, rupturing and releasing its propellant. The shuttle itself was not destroyed in a single explosion. It was torn apart by aerodynamic forces, wrenched from its mountings and shredded by the violence of supersonic air rushing past as the structure gave way. The wings, the engines, the broad delta body of the orbiter were broken into thousands of fragments and scattered across the sky. But the crew cabin, the reinforced compartment right at the front where all 7 astronauts were seated, did not come apart in that instant. It separated and remained largely whole. And what happened to that cabin in the moments that followed is the part of this story the world was never shown, and that most people even today simply do not know. The cabin, now separated from the rest of the orbiter, did not just drop straight down. At the moment of breakup, it was still moving upward, carried along by the momentum built during the 73 seconds of climb that had come before. So for a handful of additional seconds, somewhere in the neighborhood of 25 of them, the crew compartment kept rising, arcing up into the thin, freezing air above the Atlantic, reaching an estimated altitude of around 65,000 feet. That is approximately 12 miles above the ocean, higher than any commercial passenger aircraft ever flies. A small battered metal room tumbling slowly through the upper atmosphere with 7 people inside, and then it began to fall. It is genuinely hard to sit with this fact without looking away, and yet it is part of what actually happened, so it has to be said clearly. The crew cabin had no means of propulsion on its own. It had no parachute. By design, the space shuttle carried no ejection seats for the full crew, no escape pods, no system of any kind for detaching the cabin and bringing it down safely. Given the configuration of the vehicle at that altitude and speed, there was simply no survivable outcome from a breakup. The cabin was a sealed compartment in freefall with nothing whatsoever to slow its descent. From its peak altitude, the cabin fell for an estimated 2 minutes and 45 seconds, nearly 3 complete minutes. Consider just how long that really is. Long enough to read through a page, to walk the length of a hallway, to listen to a song from its opening notes to almost its final moments. For the majority of that descent, the cabin was in free fall, which means the people inside would very likely have experienced weightlessness. That same floating sensation they had trained for extensively. The sensation they had expected to feel once they reached orbit. Instead, they felt it here, plummeting toward the Atlantic somewhere below the spinning windows. The cabin hit the ocean surface at an estimated 207 miles per hour. At that kind of velocity, water no longer behaves the way water should. It does not give way, splash, or yield. It behaves more like solid stone. The deceleration in that final moment was utterly catastrophic. We will return later and carefully to what the medical investigation determined about the crew, because it matters and because the truth of it is kinder than the nature of the fall itself might lead you to expect. But first, it's worth pausing for a moment with the people who were standing on the ground looking upward during those long minutes when none of this was yet understood. Because down in the firing room and out in mission control, nobody knew what we have just walked through. The information available to them was almost nothing at all. Telemetry, that constant flow of data streaming down from the shuttle, the readings of velocity and pressure and engine performance filling their screens simply stopped, cut off. The numbers froze and went dead. On the large screens, the tracking cameras showed the smoke trail suddenly splitting apart, forking into white plumes that curled away from one another against the bright blue sky. The 2 solid rocket boosters, now separated from the vehicle they had been driving upward, went corkscrewing off in opposite directions, still burning, drawing those spiraling white ribbons that an entire generation would carry with them for the rest of their lives. In mission control, a flight controller's voice came over the loop, steady and trained, working very hard to maintain the procedural calm the job required. He said the vehicle had apparently, and here he paused before a phrase that would become one of the most quietly devastating sentences in the entire history of spaceflight. Obviously, a major malfunction. It was the language of a profession built to remain composed when disaster arrives. But beneath that composure, the truth was already taking shape. Within minutes, the people in that room understood what the silent telemetry and the diverging smoke trails meant. The shuttle was gone. The crew had almost certainly gone with it. Out at the press site and in the bleachers where families and guests had gathered to watch, the understanding arrived more slowly and far more cruelly. Many in the crowd had never witnessed a launch before. They did not know what looked normal and what did not. Some of them actually cheered for several seconds after the breakup, assuming the spreading cloud and the diverging trails were simply part of the spectacle, the boosters separating exactly as they were supposed to. The announcer's voice continued for a moment in its measured rhythm before it too faltered, and then slowly, across the faces in those stands, the realization moved like a shadow passing over an open field. Parents, spouses, children, a schoolteacher's family who had come to watch one of their own carry an everyday profession into an extraordinary place. They looked up at the sky where the shuttle had been, and they saw that it was no longer there. And in classrooms across the country, the cruelest audience of all was watching, because Challenger carried Christa McAuliffe, a high school teacher selected from among thousands of applicants to become the first ordinary citizen, the first teacher to travel into space. Schools everywhere had rolled television sets into their rooms that morning. Children were seated cross-legged on classroom floors and at their desks, all eyes fixed on the screen, watching the launch live as part of a nationwide lesson. They were watching when the smoke billowed and the trail split apart. Many of them had no idea at first what they were actually seeing. The same was true of the crowd gathered at the launch site. Teachers all across the country found themselves standing before rooms full of children, frantically reaching for words that simply did not exist, trying to explain something they could barely make sense of themselves. This is part of the reason the Challenger disaster holds the particular place it does in our shared memory. It was not concealed. It was not uncovered later through grainy footage or reconstructed from second-hand accounts. It happened in plain daylight, on live television, in front of an audience that included some of the youngest and most impressionable people in the nation. Those images, the spiraling boosters, the white plumes against the impossibly clear blue of a Florida morning, were seared into a generation's consciousness in real time, and they never truly faded. But while the world stood frozen on that image of smoke, the actual story, the one playing out miles offshore and miles below the sky, had only just begun to unfold. The fireball everyone carries in their memory was the fuel tank. The cabin, as we've mentioned, had separated intact, completed its long arc downward, and now rested somewhere along the floor of the Atlantic. And the question of what came next, how to locate it, how to recover what remained, how to treat those inside with the dignity the moment required, fell upon a group of men and women who would spend the weeks ahead doing some of the most grueling work ever asked of anyone connected to the space program. In those first hours following the breakup, nobody was willing to give up hope, and procedure did not permit them to. The Coast Guard scrambled aircraft. Helicopters lifted into the air and banked out over the water, their crews sweeping the surface for anything at all. A raft, a flash of orange, a hand rising above the swells. Navy vessels operating in the area changed course and drove hard toward the coordinates where debris had started falling. Boats from surrounding waters were summoned in. For a stretch of time, the operation was officially what every emergency response begins as a search and rescue. There were people aboard that shuttle, and the men and women now converging on the Atlantic were trained to assume, until proven otherwise, that someone might still be alive. But those who truly knew the machine understood the reality almost instantly. The Space Shuttle carried no ejection seats for its full crew. It had no escape pods, no parachutes for the cabin, no system designed to bring people safely down from the altitude at which the disaster had occurred. The orbiter had been built on the assumption that catastrophic failure during ascent was simply not survivable, and therefore no provisions had ever been made for surviving it. There was, in the cold engineering language of the program, no abort scenario covering what had just taken place. The rescue swimmers, the helicopter crews, and the sailors leaning over the rails all understood, even as they searched, what the search was most likely to become. The sea offered them no assistance. Debris was scattered across a vast stretch of ocean carried off by wind and current, some of it floating, much of it already descending toward the bottom. Crews pulled fragments from the surface that first day. Pieces of the spacecraft, insulation, shards of a machine that had been holed just minutes before, but the cabin, the thing that mattered above all else, was nowhere on the surface. It had hit the water with enough force to carry it under, sitting somewhere down in the dark, in waters 100 feet deep and more, indistinguishable from the rocks, the sand, and the surrounding wreckage. By the time that first day drew to a close, the language had shifted. The word rescue, which had carried a small and stubborn kind of hope, was quietly set aside. What remained was recovery, the long, methodical, grief-heavy work of bringing back whoever and whatever could be brought back. It is a quieter word and a heavier one. It carries no expectation of any miracle. It carries only duty, care, and the firm resolve not to leave a single person behind. What followed became one of the most expansive recovery operations NASA had ever conducted. The debris field was vast, stretching across hundreds of square miles of the Atlantic Ocean. Pieces of the shuttle had come down everywhere, ranging in size from bolts and tile fragments no bigger than a coin to enormous sections of wing and structure lying shattered on the seafloor. To search an area like that was not simply a matter of looking, it was a matter of method and system. NASA, working alongside the Navy, the Coast Guard, and a fleet of contracted vessels, divided the ocean into a grid. They would move through it section by section. Ships towed sonar arrays across the water, mapping the bottom, reading the shape of the seabed for anything that felt out of place. Wherever the sonar returned a contact, a hard signal, an object too uniform to be natural. Divers were sent down to see it with their own eyes. It was punishing, grinding work. The divers descended into cold and murky water, often fighting poor visibility, picking their way through what amounted to a graveyard of broken metal. Every shape had to be examined. Every contact had to be checked, logged, and either cleared or recovered. They worked in shifts, day after day, week after week, in conditions that wore on both body and mind. These were people who had not built the shuttle and had never flown it, and yet they were the ones who entered that water and confronted what was left of it. Many of them carried the weight of that work for the rest of their lives. They rarely spoke of it afterward, and when they did, they spoke of it the way people speak of things they would never wish upon anyone else. Through all of it, one priority rose above everything else. Of all the thousands of pieces scattered across the seafloor, the single most important thing the search needed to locate was the crew cabin. It was the largest intact section of the spacecraft, and it was where all 7 crew members had been seated when Challenger broke apart. Engineers analyzed the trajectories, the ocean currents, and the patterns of where surface debris had already been recovered, then used that data to predict where the heaviest piece on the cabin gears was most likely to have settled. They focused the search in a corridor of ocean lying to the northeast of the launch site, and they kept at it as days turned into weeks, and the weeks stretched toward and then past a full month. The families waited through all of it. They had been told, in the careful and compassionate way such things must be told, that there was no hope of survivors. But the recovery was not yet complete. And so there was no rest for them either, only the suspended, exhausting limbo of knowing the worst and still waiting for it to be confirmed, waiting for their loved ones to be found and brought home so that they might finally begin the grieving that only closure makes possible. The nation waited too. The investigation had already begun. Questions were being raised about what had gone wrong, about the cold temperatures, about the warnings that had been issued, about the decisions made in the hours leading up to launch. But running beneath those questions, slower and far sadder, was the ongoing work of the divers and the ships, mapping the dark water, listening for the shape of something that should never have been down there at all. Then, on the 7th of March, more than 5 weeks after the launch, the sonar found it, roughly 18 miles northeast of the launch site, in approximately 100 feet of water. An instrument registered a contact, a large object, the right size, in the right location. Divers were dispatched to confirm what the equipment had detected, and there, in the cold green darkness of the Atlantic floor, they found the crew cabin of the Space Shuttle Challenger. It was severely damaged. The forces of the breakup, the long fall through the sky, and the impact with the water had broken and crushed much of it. And yet it remained identifiable. The seats remained exactly where they had been. The structure that had carried all 7 of them was still recognizable for what it was. And inside, the divers discovered the remains of every one of the 7 crew members. After 5 weeks of searching, after covering thousands of square miles of ocean, and spending countless hours beneath the surface, the search had accomplished what it had set out to do. The crew was no longer missing. What followed was handled with a kind of care that is easy to pass over, but deserves a moment's pause. NASA recognized that this particular moment, out of all the moments in the long aftermath, required the greatest discretion. A secure perimeter was established around the recovery site. Press helicopters that had been circling the operation for weeks were pushed back far enough that no camera lens could capture what the divers were bringing up from below. The work was carried out quietly, methodically, and away from any watching eye. The remains were brought to the surface, transported to a secure facility, and the families were informed before a single detail reached the public. This was not secrecy for its own sake. It was a straightforward human decision to allow 7 families to learn the fate of the people they loved, without that fate being turned into a spectacle. It was dignity offered to the dead and to those who remained alive and loved them. Then came the hardest part of the work, and the hardest part of this story to sit quietly with. The remains had to be identified, and the final moments had to be understood. This was 1986, and the tools available to the examiners were those of that time. Dental records, skeletal analysis, the small personal belongings that people carry with them. One by one, each of the 7 was identified and named. Commander Scobee, Pilot Smith, Resnik, Onizuka, McNair, Jarvis, McAuliffe. Each one given back their identity, each one prepared to be returned home. The examination served a second purpose as well. The investigators needed to understand what had happened to the crew during those final 2 minutes and 45 seconds. The conclusion they reached was that all 7 had died from the trauma of impact with the ocean, a collision at more than 200 miles per hour against water that, at such speeds, behaves no differently than solid ground. Death, they concluded, would have come instantaneously at that point. Whatever the long fall had held, the end itself was not drawn out. But the evidence also carried something that has stayed with everyone who has come to learn of it in the decades since. Mounted inside the cabin were personal egress air packs, emergency air supplies designed for ground use that offered no means of survival during flight. Of the 4 that were recovered, 3 had been switched on. And here is the full weight of that detail. Those packs did not activate on their own. Someone had to reach across and turn them on by hand. The fact that 3 had been deliberately switched on strongly suggests that at least 3 of the crew were conscious and aware in the moments following the breakup, alert enough to recognize that something had gone catastrophically wrong and to do the one thing their training had prepared them to do. The packs could not have saved them, nothing could have. But they tell us quietly, across all these years, that some of the 7 knew, and that they reached for the only thing within reach. The investigators treated this with great care, and so should we. The evidence points in that direction, though it cannot tell us everything they felt or understood. It is enough simply to know that it deserves to be sat with, not turned into something sensational. By that point, the cause was already coming into clear view. A rubber seal, an O-ring in the joint of the right solid rocket booster, had failed in the unusual cold of that morning. Stiffened and hardened by temperatures it had never been designed to withstand, it failed to hold its seal, and hot gases burned through, breaching the external fuel tank. Engineers at the company that had built the boosters had raised concerns the night before, warning against a launch in such cold conditions. They had specifically recommended against launching below 53 degrees. They were overruled. The investigation into the disaster did not end with the rubber seal. It uncovered something far more troubling, a culture that had grown comfortable treating warning signs as routine, that had normalized dangerous patterns right up until the moment those patterns became fatal. All 7 crew members were laid to rest with full honors. Some were buried at a national cemetery. Others were brought back to their home states, to the communities and families who had watched them reach for the sky. A section of the recovered cabin was committed to the ocean at an undisclosed location, kept secret deliberately so it would never draw visitors seeking it out. The shuttle program was grounded for 32 months. The booster rockets were redesigned from scratch. The entire decision-making process was restructured from the ground up. And every astronaut who has flown without incident since then has done so partly because of lessons purchased at a terrible cost on that frigid January morning. That is where the true memorial lives. Not in the debris resting on the ocean floor, not in the newspaper headlines, but in the reforms that emerged from the grief, the rebuilt joints, the warnings that are finally taken seriously when someone raises them. The lives quietly safeguarded because the same errors will not be repeated. The 7 never volunteered to teach that lesson, but the lesson was absorbed, and it holds, and through it, so do they. Go ahead and say their names below if you feel moved to. Scobee, Smith, Resnik, Onizuka, McNair, Jarvis, and McAuliffe, because a name spoken aloud is a name kept alive. And tell me, of all the tragedies whose headlines you carry in memory, which untold aftermath do you believe deserves to be dragged into the light and honored? Drop it in the comments and subscribe so these stories and the people at their heart are never forgotten.